welcome. Thanks for joining me today. We are starting a brand new pattern drafting series all about how to create collars to your bodice top. This is going to be a great little mini series and I'm going to talk you through how to do 6 different types of collars. So that's going to give you a really good start to understanding the concepts of how to create different types of shapes across your neckline. We're going to start off this series by looking at how to create a flat collar. It's also known as a Peter Pan collar. It's basically just a nice wide flat collar that sits straight on top of the bodice. It hasn't got any complicated bits to it, so it's a nice straightforward one. I'm going to be talking you through how to create the collar and also the opening to the bodice top as well. As ever with the pattern drafting series, you're going to need your standard tool kit as you join me today. So go and grab all of those and we'll sit down together and we will take this away. In this collar series, we've just wanted to simplify the process of creating the block, the initial starting point. So instead of using our standard bodice block, we're actually going to use a combined waist dart block. So on the screen in front of you here, you can see that we have taken the dart that was at the shoulder and we've actually rotated it all the way around into the waist. So we just got one simple dart at the bottom. All this does is it just simplifies the process so that we're not over sewing. We're really looking and focusing at the collar and what's happening at the front of the garment as we open up the garment to get it on us. So that's why we've done that. If you're not sure how to do that, if you're not sure how to adapt your block so that it looks like this and has a combined waist dart, you can refer back to video 45 and in that video I talk you through how to do that dart manipulation step by step. So our starting point is to have our front bodice with a combined waist dart. Now, when we're looking at collars, obviously the collar's going to go up here, but we also are going to have a front opening down here. So there's no point in looking at collars unless we actually start to look at what's going on down here with the front opening. So to start off with, when we're pattern drafting, we're going to want the front and the back pieces kind of joined up together around the neckline. So we're going to take our back bodice piece and we're going to line it up with the neck point here like that. Okay. Next, I want you just to mark a point at the end over here, 2 centimeters dropped down. Then, keeping the back bodice rotated at this point, I then want us just to overlap the back bodice over the front so that the shoulder line hits the front bodice at 2 centimeters, making sure that we're still keeping the pivot point up here. Depending on the depth or the fall of your collar, that will have a really big impact aesthetically on how your top is going to look. If you have quite a narrow one, obviously that's going to look quite delicate. If you have a big bold one, it's going to look really big and bold. So you choose what you want to do. I think for this, I'm going to do a reasonably big one just so we can really see the impact as we're pattern drafting together. I'm then going to draw on my collar at a depth of 8 centimeters. So draw a line that is a nice soft curve, I should say, that is parallel to the neckline at 8 centimeters. So this guarantees that we've got a consistent fall or depth to our collar. What we now want to do is just create a really beautiful little curve so that we've got a nice soft curve to our collar. So use your pattern drafting ruler and find that beautiful curve. Then just draw in your collar line. Okay, so we've got our basic collar shape, which is brilliant. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed that when you sew collars, sometimes the under bit, obviously we're going to have a top collar and then an under collar. So when you flip it up, you've got the right side of the fabric on both sides. Sometimes it's quite hard to make the under collar sit nicely underneath. So in order to do this, there's a really simple little pattern drafting technique that we can do. So what we basically want to do is to draft 2 pattern pieces for the collar, one for the top and one for the bit that goes underneath. So we've got the upper collar up here and might just label that so that I've got it on my screen here. Upper collar. I want my upper collar to be 3 millimeters wider in the fall of the collar compared to the under collar. So when I'm drawing out the block for the under collar, I just want it to be 3 millimeters inset and smaller than this outer line here. So grab your ruler and just offset a line that is 3 mm away from your outer line. And then just draw that line in. Brilliant. Okay, so we've adapted our block and manipulated that so that we've now drawn on our two collars, the under collar and the upper collar. At this point, we're going to create our pattern pieces by adding seam allowance. Because this is the centre back line down here, we don't need to add a seam allowance to it. We're actually just going to cut it on the fold because we're going to have an opening at the centre front. Draw in your 1.5 cm seam allowance to the neckline. Annotate your pattern piece. We're going to place this on the fold. Our grain line is actually going to run parallel with our centre back. Peter Pan collar, this is the upper collar, cut 1 on fold. Now the only other helpful thing that you might want to annotate is the fact that we've got a joining of the seam at this point here. So we're just going to add a notch in there just to make sure that we've annotated that and it's nice and clear as to where that's going to connect in with the side seam. That's just going to help us as we're attaching the two things together. Okay, great. Once we've done our pattern piece for our upper collar, let's just repeat the whole process for the under collar. So I'm just following my blue line, my inner line, and offsetting it about 1.5 cm as I go around the collar. Obviously, you should be using a sharp pen as always with the pattern drafting series. I'm using a fat marker pen so you can see it on the screen above. And then do your 1.5 cm offset around the neckline as well. Add in your notch for your shoulder seam. And then annotate your pattern piece the same as we did for the other one. Grain line. Peter Pan collar, under collar, cut 1 on fold. Lovely. Okay, let's cut those pattern pieces out and then we'll attach them on to the bodice. Great, so when we were drafting the collar, we did a bit of an overlap, didn't we, at this point here, between the front and the back. And that was just a 2 cm overlap to ensure that the collar is going to sit nice and flat on our shoulders and not kind of stick up, which doesn't look that good. So what we're going to do now is just finish off drafting our button placket at the front, and we're going to leave the back pattern piece exactly as it is because it's going to be cut on the fold, so we don't need to make any changes to our block at that point. So pop that one to one side and let's grab our centre front pattern piece. First thing we want to do is to mark a point where we want our buttons to come down our centre front. So let's have a think about this. If the widest point of our bust is where our apex is, we want the button to close over that widest bit, otherwise we're going to get gapping in the top as it buttons down our front. So mark a point along the centre front which runs parallel with your apex, okay, so straight across the centre front. That then becomes one buttonhole. Next, I'm going to use this fun little tool here, which is a sewing gauge tool specifically designed for helping you allocate where buttons should go. So as you can see, it expands and contracts equal distances, and so this is going to be really helpful for us. So I know that I definitely want one button here, and then if I just sort of extend that out, I can see that an equidistance will give me a nice one down here and nice equidistances between all of them. You can obviously just use your pattern drafting ruler as well if you want to. I'm just going to mark on the points where I want the buttons across the centre front line here. Next, I'm going to draw a line which is parallel to the centre front at 2.5 centimetres offset from the centre front. So we know our buttons are going to be located exactly on the centre front line where I've got these dashed lines kicking in, okay? And that's really helpful to know. But what we also want to do is just allocate on the block where we want our buttonholes to go. So we actually want our buttonhole to just be, to start, 2 millimetres away from our centre front line. So mark a point that is just 2 millimetres away from the centre front line, and I'm really going to have to use a sharp pencil for this because it is so detailed and so close to that initial line. I'm just going to draw in an arbitrary button line length, just going to be 2 centimeters long in total, and it's going to stop at that 2mm line away from the center front. Can you see that? Now when you actually come to sew up your buttons, your button width will dictate the width of your buttonhole, obviously. This is just a nice little reference. And the critical point is the 2mm offset from the center front line. The final block adaptation that we want to make is to actually add the facing, because the facing is going to help hold the collar down and create a nice neat finish around the neckline, and it's also going to help the buttons to sit really nicely and comfortably. So let's do that together now. Now your facing really can be any width that you want it to be. I don't want it to conflict with my darts because I think that's going to add in too much volume. So I'm actually just going to draw my facing at an arbitrary 5 centimeters offset from the center front to start off with. So draw a line, maybe a dashed line for this one because it's facing. You don't want to, you've got a lot of lines going on in your blocks now. And then mark a point 5 centimeters around the neckline as well. Just going to use my pattern drafting ruler just to create a really nice soft curve. We don't want any big dramas happening in that area. There's no need for that, so just going to soften that curve along nicely. This then becomes our facing line. I might just mark that on. Excellent. Let's make our pattern pieces out of this block front now. Add your 1.5 centimeter seam allowance to your shoulder seam, and likewise to your side seam. Draw in your arm side. We're not attaching that to anything in this block, so it's just having no seam allowance. And likewise with the waist, we're not attaching the waist to a skirt or anything else. We're just keeping this really simple, with the main focus just being the collar and how it attaches to the bodice. Draw in the waist dart. Add your 1.5 centimeter seam allowance to your button stand, because that is going to attach to your facing. And then finally, add your seam allowance to your neckline. On this pattern piece, I am going to annotate where my button edge needs to be. Draw in your buttonholes. And then I'm just going to draw in across where I want my actual buttons to be. You can do this however you want to, however you find that helpful. Great. The grain line is going to run parallel with the centre front, obviously, as it always does with these things. Peter Pan collar, bodice front, cut 2. Okay, once we've done our bodice front, it's here in front of us, we're then just going to trace over the facing. So we're going to trace over this green line here. We don't need to add a seam allowance to this line here. That can just be overlocked and finished nicely on the inside. Okay, and again, no seam allowance at the bottom waistline, but we do need to add a seam allowance to this line here, and to the neckline. Grain line, Peter Pan collar, front facing, cut 2. So the only thing we need to do to the back bodice block is simply to draw in our line for where our facing is going to go. Everything else is just staying nice and simply the same as normal. Our facing was 5 centimeters wide, wasn't it, at the front? So just annotate where that needs to sit on your block. Because we've got the opening at the front of the garment, we don't need to add a seam allowance to the centre back. Add your 1.5 centimeter seam allowance around your neckline. Annotate the facing piece, place on fold. Grain line we want to follow the centre back. This is our Peter Pan collar, back facing, cut 1 on fold. Once you've done the facing, you can then just trace over the main block. Add the seam allowance to your neckline. Draw in a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance to the shoulders. Draw in your dart. The centre back will be placed on the fold, so just draw a straight line down there. Likewise with the arm side, we're not doing a sleeve, so just draw that in. Add your seam allowance to your side seam and draw in your waist, along with the waist dart. Place on fold. Peter Pan collar, bodice back, cut 1, unfold, and then finally our grain line follows the centre back. Perfect. Let's cut out all of our pattern pieces now out of our tracing paper and then out of our calico, and then we're going to sew it up together. So we have quite a lot of pattern pieces cut out here, which is brilliant. The first thing we're going to do is just sort of prep all the pieces that need to go together. So we're going to start off just by sewing the darts to our front and to our back, just to prep those so they're all ready to go. Then, don't forget, if you're not sure how to sew up a dart, you can refer back to video 22, where I talk you through that in a lot more detail. Once you've sewn all your darts for the back, just press them towards the side seams, and likewise with the front pattern pieces, just press those towards the side. Okay, so we have two pattern facing pieces. One is the front and one is the back. So this is the back around the neck. So we just want to sew these two together next. So effectively, we're wanting it to look something like this, aren't we? So it's going round like that. We've got a nice round neckline here, obviously with our seam allowances at the top. With right sides together, fold the shoulder seams on top of each other and pin in place. Stitch in place using a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. And once you've sewn those seams, just press them open. Okay, next we're going to look at how to attach the two collar pieces. We've got one under collar and one upper collar. The under collar is slightly smaller in width or fall of the collar compared to the upper collar. The first thing we want to do is with right sides together, we want to sew this curved seam together. Pop right sides together, and as you would expect, it's a little bit narrower all the way around. That's absolutely fine. What we want to do though is just to make sure that we are pinning with the raw edges matching all the way around the curve as much as possible. So I'd start in the middle and work your way around, put some kind of reference pins in place. So you're getting that stretch across the fabric nicely. Brilliant, so let's just stitch that in place now using a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Great, next we want your under collar to be facing up on the screen, and we're going to grab a pair of scissors and we're just going to trim that seam allowance in half all the way around. The reason why we're going to tie in half is so we don't have a massive big bulky seam all the way around the edge of the collar. The next thing we're going to do is just snip into all the curves to take out the tension. Okay, so turn it the right side facing out now. And once you've done that, we're then just going to press that collar so it sits beautiful and flat. Okay, with right sides together, we're going to lay the front over the back and just sew that in place at the shoulder seams. Once you've sewn those seams, you can then press them open so they sit nice and flat. Okay, so we've got our lovely pattern piece here in front of me right now, and you can see on the line markings I drew a dotted line where I wanted the edge of the buttonholes to be, but the centre front line is actually where the button line is. So I'm just going to add a little notch up along the collar line, which denotes where the centre front of the top is. That is really critical actually, because what we're going to do is to line our collar front with those notches. So pop this back with the right side now facing up, you've got your two little notches. And next, take your collar pattern piece, and with the underside of the collar, we want that to be facing the right side of the bodice. Now, we've got two little notches in our collar here and here, and they're going to line up with those side seams. And then the edge of the collar here is going to line up with the centre front line here. That should pin reasonably nicely. So just carefully take your time and pin that together. if you're working with really delicate fabric, it's often a good idea around the neckline just to do some stay stitching. If your fabric is very delicate, obviously we're just pattern drafting really and just checking the shape, so that's less relevant with this particular fabric because it's really firm. Okay, now at this point I'm just going to sew a line of basting stitches within the seam allowance. My basting stitches are going to be a stitch length of 4 or 5 millimeters long, and they're going to be probably about 1 centimeter away from the raw edge. That means that when I come to sew my facing on that seam, that row of stitches won't be seen on the outer garment. The next thing we're going to do is just with right sides together, simply place the facing on top of all of that. Now, if you're finishing your garment and it's the finished garment, you may well want to just finish the raw edges of your facing to start off with, but as we're just drafting this out, I will not be doing that. Okay, once you've done your neckline, then we're just going to attach the facing all the way down the button stand down here, and likewise for the other side. Now there's quite a lot of bulk in this seam. We've got a lot of different things going on here. So we're just going to reduce the bulk. Start off by snipping through the corners at a nice diagonal so they'll fold in nice and neatly. And then we also want to just reduce the whole of this, the bulk of this volume. So trim the facing in half, the facing seam in half all the way around. Beautiful, and then just snip into all these curves. Okay, and then the final thing that we want to do to this particular section is just turn it right side, wrong sides together, and just press that in place. Okay, so we now have the beginnings of a really beautiful little collar top here. The only thing that we are missing is obviously our side seams and our buttons. So with right sides together, we're just going to pin and then sew our side seams together. Brilliant. At this point, you can then sew your buttons and your buttonholes so that they're going to sit beautifully, and one is just going to go right underneath the other like that, and our centre front is going to be right in the middle. So here you go. How do you think that looks? A really cute little detail there. Absolutely love it. Reasonably simple to draft up in terms of how it's just nice and flat, and yeah, has a really dramatic effect. You can really see how altering the fall or the depth of the collar would really have a big aesthetic impact, wouldn't it? I hope you found that first video all about collars really interesting and engaging, that you've had loads of fun just understanding those little tweaks and changes to the block which have a really big impact on how the collar is going to sit on your body. As ever, we'd love to hear from our maker community here at Minerva, so do create a free account on our website where you can upload your photos and share with the maker community where you're up to with your pattern drafting experiments. I'd absolutely love to see people experimenting and having loads of fun with different shapes of collars and different kind of fits and looks. It'd be really fun to see what you guys are up to. So thank you for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure to film this little series for you. Next week we will be looking at how to create a similar collar but with a low neckline, and that's going to have some impact on our bodice front shaping as well. So stay tuned for that. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you next time.